Looking at regional opportunities, thinking about collaboration across borders, thinking about trade, about supply chains, about policy harmonization and opportunities. And we've got a really great lineup here, a panel from different aspects of Canada, US, North America, and internationally. So I'd invite you, if you'd like, to come a little closer. Move closer to the stage if you want. I know these guys would love to see your faces up close if you're open to that.
Behind pillars.
Give us energy.
Yeah.
Give them some energy, I know.
It's the final push.
They don't have coffee up here. All they have is water, so they need your energy. I'll pass it over to our colleague here, Mark, from the Council for the Great Lakes region to introduce and let him go from here.
Yeah,
thanks.
That's great. Thanks for that introduction, Paul. My name is Mark Fisher. I'm the president and CEO of an organization called the Council of the Great Lakes Region. Just to give you a bit of background about us, we've been around since 2013. We are a binational nonprofit, and we serve as a forum to bring together business, all sectors alongside government, local, state, provincial, federal, as well as academia, the broader nonprofit sector, to really look at the Great Lakes region as a shared economy, but also an important natural resource that we need to work together to protect for future generations. Our geographic area is Ontario and Quebec, and then we also work across the 8 Great Lakes states on the U.S. side of the border. And the circular economy, plastics in particular, is a super hot topic for us, just as it is for a number of you and lots of others around the world. And so this session today, we've got about an hour with each other. We'll leave some time for some questions at the end. Is around effective collaboration at the regional level and how essential it's going to be to scaling the circular economy and looking at the ambitions, both in the Canada-US context, the North American context, globally, because we know that our economies are interconnected, supply chains are interconnected. And so this is going to be a great opportunity to delve into some of those issues. And I think just to give you a bit more context in terms of why this cross-border scaling up discussion is important, again, just using the Great Lakes region as a reference point, the research that we've done in the region has shown that roughly 12 million US tons of rigids and flexible plastics are ending up in our landfills. That's the equivalent of about $1.5 billion worth of materials that we're literally throwing out every year. But we've also found that 80% of the material that's washing up on the Great Lakes shoreline is plastic. 20 million pounds of plastics could be going into the Great Lakes through a variety of sources and pathways, just as we see in our ocean. So I know we're going to have a bit of a broader discussion beyond plastics today, but just to give you, a bit more of that context. So with us today, we've got an exceptional panel. In the room, we've got Ramona Liberoff, who's the CEO for PACE, who we heard from earlier today. She's doing double duty. Thank you for doing that. We also have Ilse Esparza. Esparza. I got to work on my Spanish. I'm having a hard enough time with French. I'm doing better, but I got to throw Spanish in there. Who's the project lead for green growth with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And online, we can see you. It's Adina Adler, who's the Deputy Executive Director for Silverado Policy Accelerator. It's great to see you, Adina, and hope you're doing well. So we're going to start with Ramona. We've got a series of questions. And so just to start us off, so PACE has been involved from doing research, convening in the circular economy for some time, to taking what's described as a systems acupuncture approach. I loved it when you said that this morning. I'm just like, I've never heard of that. That's fantastic. Your 3 areas of focus are scaling minerals circularity for global resilience, recapturing resources for circular food production, and integrating circularity and net zero measures. So maybe just explain to this audience in a bit more detail, what does systems acupuncture really mean? And can you give us some of the examples of how it's being applied?
Sure, I'm happy to. And thanks, Mark. And it's a real pleasure to be here again. So I get a little more time now to go into a little bit of the stuff I trailered this morning. Just by way of background, the way we look at the circular economy is really to separate it out into a couple of different parts. I know many people in this room and many people working in circular economy do fantastic work on what I would call the consequences of mispriced overconsumption, which is a fancy way of saying stuff is too cheap and therefore ends up being thrown away because there isn't enough infrastructure to cope with the volume of that. So we leave that to others because there's a ton of work happening, the Global Plastics Pact, work that people like Loudis Foundation are doing on textiles. And also because we appreciate, very early in my career, I started in consumer marketing, and frankly, to change consumer behavior is a very heavy lift and takes a lot of talent, skill, and money, which we don't have. We have the talent, we have the skill, we haven't got the money. So that's explaining why we don't work on those particular issues. But because one of our advantages is that we are embedded within the World Resources Institute, whose work some of you may know, we realized there were a number, after consulting with 25 knowledge partners, including WRI, we realized there were a number of significant and significantly underexplored areas in critical systems. We have Janusz Potocznik, who's the co-chair of the International Resource Panel, on our board to keep us honest and very afraid before board meetings, because he's rightly very tough in making sure that the work we're doing is important. But we looked at these systems and we thought, actually, within each of these systems, if we were to find various levers and really implement the circular economy at scale, by which we mean everything, business models, infrastructure, policy, behavior, collaborations, whatever that means, there would be significant benefits for people, planet, and nature. And just to give you one example of that, in minerals, for instance, where we're starting out the work and hopefully actually collaborating with Adina and her amazing team on this as well, the work done by the Energy Transition Commission and others has identified that somewhere up to a third or half of the critical minerals we need for the energy transition are already out of the ground. Someone mentioned earlier in the batteries workshop that there's no easy way to repurpose or recapture them. It's all very unclear. The facilities haven't yet built, the infrastructure. We're very good at getting stuff to people. We're not very good at getting it back from people. And there's a kind of early warning system for this in electronics, where Apple, who are on our board, actually tried to do this and realized they ran smack into a bunch of practical and legislative challenges to do it. So once you break that problem down and you say, great, we could meet a ton of demand, we could take stress off the system around the world if we could just recapture these minerals, then you start to actually see what the detailed levers could be underneath. And I won't go into any more detail, but just to give you a sense of how that acupuncture approach works. What we like about that term, by the way, is it's intuitive. If anyone's ever had a niggling shoulder pain and gone to an acupuncturist, you understand how it releases the pressure and the stress in the system. So thanks for giving me a chance to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I could use a bit of acupuncture. Never tried it, but it sounds great. So you talked about the Apple experience, and I think over the course of today and yesterday, we've just heard about the importance of moving from theory to action to implementation, the speed, the scale. From your vantage point, like what do you think is going to really kick us forward from this ongoing dialogue, conversation, diagnosing the problem to real substantive actions that we see not only at the global level, but, and we'll get to this, in North America and in the US and Canada. So what's really going to move us forward from that theory, that dialogue, to real action?
At the risk of being very boring and very blunt, money. Because, I really am incredibly impressed by what people manage to do with tiny, tiny bits of funding. But when I see, for example, that there's $3 million given for research in this area, when I look at the fact that we effectively have an operating budget of sub $1 million to scale the circular economy around the world every year, it is not only not enough, it's ludicrously not enough. And I actually would particularly want to ask philanthropists and anyone with public sector money to put their hands in their pockets, figure out a way to raise some taxes and get this going at scale. So that's one thing. It's not just money, though. It's also clarity of focus. And this is also why, I held ourselves accountable to make sure we knew what we were doing and not just skate across the surface. Because as many people have said, the circular economy is so big, so broad, and operates at micro, meso, macro levels. It's a philosophy, it's a technology, it's a social revolution. It's all these things, but it can't be all these things. It actually has to be something very specific, which is to create something using a combination of policy, innovation, and finance, and do it very, very quickly. And then the third thing is coordinated action. And I'd go so far as to say a bit more radical collaboration than coordinated action, because coordinated action leads you into the kind of committees I've spent rather too much time sitting in, where there are many, many remarks but not necessarily that many actions.
Yeah, and I think just to back up your point, hopefully they're taking their hands out of their pockets with a checkbook, and they're not leaving their hands in the pockets.
We take anything. We take Bitcoin, Venmo, barter. We'll take it all.
So we'll go to Ilse next with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. Maybe just give a bit of background about the CEC. But circular economy, sustainable materials management is a relatively new strategic pillar for the CEC. Can you speak a little bit to those priorities, the operational plan? Maybe give people a little bit of background about the CEC. Not sure if everybody's familiar with what you do. So kick us off and give us sort of the North American bird's eye view.
Yeah, sure. So what I've learned so far is that we're not super well known. So I'll just give you an overview of who we are and what we do. So the Commission of Environmental Cooperation, the CEC, is an intergovernmental organization. We were established in 1994 under the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, which is basically the environmental side of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Now, as of 2020, now we operate under the Environmental Cooperation Agreement, which was developed in parallel to the Canada, US, Mexico Agreement, the CUSMA. So what we do is, this agreement basically recognizes the social, environmental, and economic linkages between the three countries. That's what's relevant. Well, that's a key part of our work. And what else can I tell you? Well, so the way we work is that we basically facilitate the cooperative work between the three North American countries. And we work on pressing regional and global issues related to the environment and to trade. So for this, we have a 5-year strategic plan. The current one goes from 2021 to 2025. And it currently includes circular economy and sustainable materials management as one of the strategic pillars of our work. And for these, what we've been doing lately is working on different projects and initiatives that have been indirectly linked to circular economy. This includes some projects that we have on food loss and waste, others on recycling and solid waste management. We also work on things a bit less related to circularity, such as ghost gear management, but also supply chain transparency. And as of last year, we recently started working directly with circular economy. During the last council session, the three countries announced their interest and support to work on circular economy and use circular economy approaches to achieve more sustainable consumption and production patterns. So right now we're working with a group of experts from the three countries. Some of them are here today, so it was nice seeing them. And we're currently trying to decide how this initiative is gonna look like. We're still in conversations, but some ideas that have popped up are potentially focusing on a supply chain of common interest. We've talked about for example, electronics. We'd also talk about the built environment, but we're still unsure how the initiative is going to look like, and I will keep you posted on what we're doing. But yeah, right now we're deciding and brainstorming.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And so you touched on transforming recycling, solid waste management. It's a new priority. What are some of the projects, if I remember correctly, within the operational plan, there's some funded projects that I think are being considered or underway currently. Can you speak a little bit to the nature of those projects and what are some of the desired outcomes?
Yeah, Yeah, we have a project on recycling and solid waste management. And it's an exciting project because it's a 4-year project. So it's weird for the commission that we have such a big, long project. And it has 2 phases, and we're going to be focusing on 3 waste streams. So plastics, bioplastics, and paper. And what we want to do is first conduct milestones projects to understand the different opportunities that are out there in terms of recycling and the secondary materials market in North America, and also to evaluate the current state of infrastructure in terms of recycling. So that's what we're doing right now, and there will be another phase based on the results that we get from these first milestones project, to try and identify what type of pilot projects can we do based on the information that we get.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Just before we go to Adina, any kind of lessons or any kind of early sort of perspectives or views that have come out of that work so far on a North American basis, or is it really let's wait till the projects are done to really see what the big aha conclusions are?
Well, in general, so far, for me, the work that we have done so far has taught me the importance of collective work. Like that's key, and it's not easy, and it takes time, but that's what we need, as well as working at a broader scale. Like a lot of interesting projects that I've learned about during this summit are local, but we somehow need to link them a bit better, because the way the economy works right now and the way the supply chains work at the moment are not local. So it's key to have like regional scale efforts and even global to really achieve circularity. So that's very relevant. And finally, also to be sharing information and learn more about what's going on right now, because again, a lot of interesting efforts are happening, and I learned a lot about what's going on in Canada at the moment through this summit, but we need to be more aware of all that to avoid duplicated efforts, and also to build from the existing efforts that have already been done. So
yeah. That's super helpful. Thank you. Let's go to Adina next, who's Deputy Executive Director of Silverado Policy Accelerator. Adina has really been on the front lines of America's trade policy sustainability agenda for a number of years. Adina, why don't we talk a little bit about Silverado, the work that you're doing, and maybe offer sort of your perspectives on what you see happening in the US right now from a circular economy perspective.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that. Thank you all for the invitation. I'd rather be with you in person, but a health matter has me sort of grounded for a little while. So I'm grateful for the virtual link to be a part of the conversation. So just quick introduction of Silverado. We're what we call a think do tank here in Washington, focused on key national security issues, including where we see the intersection between economic and ecological security. And that's where our circular economy work falls, because we're thinking about how trade in the environment and how trade can help fight climate change really is an economic as well as an environmental benefit. And being the do tank that we are is we don't just come up with ideas, we try to actively engage to see them across the finish line, just as Ramona has alluded to, in partnership. But here in the US, the concept of circular economy was quite slow to be taken up, but it has been adopted as a phrase and as a mindset and as a strategy, although still in parallel with what we would call sustainable materials management, where you still think about life cycle issues, where sometimes the take-up of a product made from primary may still be more environmentally beneficial in some way. But at least the concept of circular economy there is a focus. I do think it's still pretty narrow in the recycling, reuse, refurbishment space, although everybody here today understands circular economy to be much broader. But I'm just going to kind of focus on those narrow areas because that's what the government is focusing on. So the US EPA does have a circular economy strategy at a high level. There's 4 components: improve markets, increase collection, reduce contamination, and enhance policies so they can better track and collect data on that. And there is a draft national strategy specific to plastics pollution, but these strategies are only focused on municipal recycling, what happens at households. And here in the United States, municipal recycling only accounts for 20% of the recycling ecosystem here in the US. So good that the government has a strategy, but it really is just a small component of our economy. Much bigger than that, just, we're a federalist system. So in 1976, the Congress passed the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the EPA promulgated regulations, and then they devolved the implementation down at the states, who had to create what's called state authorizations. And according to EPA's website, those authorizations are intended to ensure national consistency and minimum standards while providing flexibility to states in implementing rules. And so there's that word flexibility, because as you all know, we have 50 states plus the District of Columbia, which means there are 51 different paths towards circularity. And it can get very confusing, and you have everything from like California, Oregon, New Jersey, Washington State, who are national leaders with rules on recycling targets, truth in labeling, recyclability claims, manufacturing products with recycled content, all the way to the other side of the spectrum where there, and I don't want to name and shame any, but there are some states that just meet the base minimum requirements, but also fall short on, access and infrastructure, especially if they are states with large swaths of rural land. So, and then even from that state level, you get down to the municipal level, and depending on who you talk to, because I have not found the exact number, but it's anywhere between 10,000 and 20,000 municipalities across the United States that also handle waste management and recycling very differently. And since China's regulatory changes and the impact that has had on the market, it means these municipalities had to make tough decisions between paying for education and law enforcement or paying for recycling. And a lot of that depends again on infrastructure and contracts and different strategies. So it's a little bit of a mishmash, but getting back to Washington, Congress has been paying attention because they're getting calls from their constituents about why, won't my certain types of materials be recycled? And there are proposals in our Congress that look at things like improving data collection, mandating the use of recycled content, although there's a bill that both mandates the use of recycled content and then bans those products. I'm not sure how you square that circle, but there's also a bill that I support, that we support, and a number of organizations support, that would, for the very first time, establish a federal definition of recycling. Because otherwise, what we're left with is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which classifies everything at the end of its life like a solid waste. And that has an impact on whether or not those materials can be re-entered into the manufacturing supply stream. Again, we've been talking a lot about the municipal here and the challenges, especially with plastics and paper, but I want to make sure that I note that the other 80% of recycling in the United States is in the commercial and industrial. Commercial, thinking of like retail outlets that receive a lot of things in big boxes, and they can crush those boxes, and those are easily recyclable, to the industrial, where the auto parts factories punch out the metal that they need, and they have leftover that can go right back into recycling. So 80% of our industry. So you have an EPA that doesn't necessarily have a strategy about that. There is an exemption to the solid waste definition, but currently we have an EPA administrator that doesn't look kindly on the recycling operations, especially those with shredders. So it's really hard to figure out, where circular economy is going right now when you have these competing interests and you don't have all the laws fully in place. But at least the awareness is there and people are paying attention.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And maybe if we can just jump down to the state level, you mentioned Oregon, you mentioned Colorado, California, which tend to be leaders on a lot of these issues. What's the state of the debate, the discussion that you see across, the rest of the country? Certainly starting to see some more active discussions in the Great Lakes region, Illinois, and a few others talking about EPR. What's the state of play at the state level?
Again, we're still talking about lots of different states, right? So,
yeah.
But I think, if to make to create a thread between them, they pay attention to each other. So we have the world's 7th largest economy. The Republic of California, of course, has been out front on circular economy policy for a long, long time. And the other states are looking at, their policies and their regulations and saying, okay, we really like what they're doing, but of course we have to create it for our own purposes and what makes sense for us. But they're also, still hearing from constituents who want to do right by the environment, and yet, they're having, they're not able to recycle everything that they want to. And so that's where you see proposals like extended producer responsibility popping up. I am personally, and I speak for myself, not my organization, but personally, a little hesitant on extended producer responsibility, as both the US and Canadian economies are market-driven. EPR is not exactly a market-driven policy, because you instill the mandate to pay for recycling on a company whose business model is not to do that. And so they may not exactly engage in a race to the top in innovating on recycling. They're just going to try to meet, bare minimum requirements. So it has and also we've seen companies go out of business in existing EPR schemes. So, it's an interesting approach, and there are states that are taking a look at it. But what I do see also is that they're actually in active conversations with the recycling industry anyway. So you can create an EPR scheme that doesn't put them out of business, that can be a race to the top, that can have some elements of market drive in there. And I think it's a good, a good trend forward.
Yeah, that's super helpful. We're going to work our way backwards here. So obviously, Adina, you and we'll go to Ilse next. You give a lot of thought to USMCA from a trade policy perspective. CUSMA's been around, CUSMA here, USMCA, been around for a few years. Is there anything in the agreement that you see as a particular enabler of looking at circular economy across borders potentially? Yeah, US, Canada, Mexico. Maybe your thoughts on that, and Ilse, maybe from a CEC perspective, what do you see as potential enablers for scaling the circular economy across borders?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, well, just as a top line, what's so important about that agreement is that there are aspects for facilitating trade. You have transparency, digital processes, just the movement of people is actually really important to any industry, including in circularity. We have standards, including the recognition of industry standards. That was a really important innovation, for lack of a better word, that from the CUSMA over the NAFTA. Of course, it's eliminated tariffs. There's respect for environmental labor rights. And then you layer on top of that we have currency equivalence, we have common language and market economy. And so just having those foundational aspects has really allowed a circular economy. It actually already thrives, especially between Canada and the United States, but also I see it between the United States and Mexico. I'm less knowledgeable about between Mexico and Canada because of the break in the land access, for truck moval. But having our intertwined economies, especially between the U.S. and Canada, in the post-war era, but especially with the automotive products agreement that was signed in 1965, which was the precursor for NAFTA, and then the CUSMA. I mean, because of that, we've already seen circular economy in action. The automotive sector requires a lot of metal. And so much of that metal in North America is made from scrap. And so you already see the movements across borders of scrap into a steel mill back across the border to make the auto part back across the other border to be integrated into an automobile. And that works really perfectly. But we even see it actually in some segments of plastic sectors where there are certain types of agricultural used plastic that is collected and cleaned and then goes into Canada for further processing into a material that can be reintegrated into manufacturing. But there is, of course, scope for more. But I think it's really driven by the growth of industries The Inflation Reduction Act will be very helpful in even expanding that even more, especially as Canada is deemed a domestic U.S. supplier under our Defense Procurement Act and other opportunities like these initiatives that will just continue to allow the circular economy to thrive because the industries that require the materials are thriving.
Yeah, super helpful. Ilse, any additional perspectives that you want to offer from a USMCA CUSMA, enabler, any challenges that you see in terms of scaling across borders?
Yeah, well, I can maybe comment a bit on that. So, well, the way I see it, and in a role at the CC, is that it's key to have this link between the three countries and have just people talking and sharing about like issues that are of common interest, and maybe they're just sometimes you don't have the right spaces to talk about and put together a group of experts and governments talking about it. So that's relevant from our side. And I'm not very familiar of the actual agreement that we have, but an example where collaborative work at a regional scale has worked very well is, for example, on hazardous waste. It's not perfect still, but for example, we do have a program that helps the region identify how hazardous waste move and where it's taken. So that has really helped the three countries communicate and to really know where everything is being moved. So that's an example of where we can get through collaborative work through a regional scale.
Yeah, that's helpful. Ramona, looking at it, the global sphere, any thoughts in terms of, what do you see that's working well? What are the key ingredients for scaling across borders? What do you see maybe be some of the issues that are getting in the way, causing a bit more drag than you would like to see?
I have so many thoughts, Mark. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Fire away, we've got
I've been trying
time.
to think about examples that may be very interesting for people that may not be widely known. So I think the very first thing to do is for everyone to just switch their mind for a moment, just accompany me in a thought experiment. Human beings design these borders, but actually human beings also design supply chains that are very global and interconnected in nature. So although there may well be opportunities for contiguous collaboration, the borders are in a way a kind of accident, and they're not necessarily where the greatest opportunities are. So I think one of the very interesting things that I see is the scramble for national security around minerals. And if people don't necessarily understand the greater good or environment, and I hear this term resource rich quite a lot as a reason to not do something, which is kind of interesting because you think you want to preserve your resources, but I understand the context. If you want to reframe that issue as either national security or with an equity lens, think about the fact that most of the burden of our current mineral need is going to fall on the global south and be unsustainable even more than, and we cannot open mines fast enough, nor should we necessarily want to see that as a first option in the global north to meet the need. I find it really interesting that today's FT or yesterday's FT, there was a piece on Norway, obviously as a very oil-dependent state, examining deep sea mining. I don't see an article in the FT talking about Norway trying to recapture all the minerals or building out battery infrastructure. So I guess all I'd say is there are common issues everywhere, but I think a lot of it starts with our mindset about the circular economy needs to be about reduction first and foremost. That's why it's actually at the top of the list. So things like efficiency considerations, design considerations, I don't hear them talked about anything like as often as I do recycling. And then the second piece is this sort of recapture piece. We have so much out in the world. Resource rich shouldn't necessarily mean we have things we can cut down or dig up. It can actually mean we have a lot that we can recapture. And there's three little things I just wanted to throw out into the room. Who knows what the price is today of carbon in Amsterdam? I'll take a little poll. Give me a guess. How much is the price of a ton of carbon for planning purposes? Remember, we set this, we can set it or whatever we want in life. What is it? I'll take any bids.
Wild guesses. Come on.
Sorry, I hear 100.
I heard 300.
300, any advance? Don't Google it. Okay, it is, as a great thought experiment, in the donut economic city of Amsterdam, 418 euros a ton, ladies and gentlemen. Exactly. So I think it's one of these interesting things where if you start doing stuff like that, that suddenly creates an incentive for a very different competitive landscape. And coming back to the contention that North America is a market economy, I think the EU is a market economy as well. We have consumers, we have producers, we have money. We even have virtual money these days, so advanced. But one of the interesting things about some of the EPR legislation and initiatives is, so for example, France has had a textile EPR since I believe it's 2007. And they have raised more than 6 billion euros to invest immediately back into things like digital product passports, innovation. We heard this morning that one of the biggest challenges we have is trying to find enough inward investment for innovation, and proper businesses that can scale up and meet some of the complex demands we have. And we know that technology, like AI, can make an enormous difference in the efficiency of a lot of these problems. So maybe if we thought about EPR less as a sort of burdensome regulation that makes people think about the future when they'd rather think about the present, it could also be this way of raising some of this much needed immediate capital to really boost the venture sector. And then my third thing, and I promise I'll stop there, let me look at my notes. The third thing is actually litigation. So I find extremely interesting the fact that, Adina very helpfully referenced a number of the laws that are already on the books that have led us in fairly slow fashion to evolution, and that are partially applied or that leave a lot of latitude. But where you have laws that are tougher, I don't know if anyone knows that the British government was taken to court by Client Earth. Someone's heard this story, for not being specific enough about how it's going to meet its net zero targets. A plastics recycling facility was shut down in Belgium, again by a lawsuit by Client Earth. And I think that if ideas travel very fast in this world of ours, in a highly litigious market economy, perhaps, not naming any names, but you might imagine, then the idea of actually being a significant risk for not meeting commitments, it may start to come into play. So I think there's just a whole bunch of different dimensions that are perhaps a little bit broader than the very specific definition of cross-border. Hope you don't mind me throwing those in.
No, that's super helpful. And then going back to you, Adina, when you look at the discussion, the debates across the U.S. at the federal, at the state level, to a lesser extent at the municipal level, where do you see the conversation moving in the right direction, or potentially where do you see the discussions and the debates really getting bogged down? Or I don't want to don't want to get partisan about it, but where do you really see divergence? And is there hope that we're going to get to a national framework that can make sense in a reasonable amount of time?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The divergence is not necessarily like a party line thing. It's probably more, in the industrial versus the NGO, non-industrial community, where you have companies that feel like they're already doing the right thing, and then you have groups that might come in and say, no, you're not, and of course. I haven't really tracked thinking about litigation, so Ramona has freaked me out a little bit, thinking about what the possibilities could be here in the U.S.
New line of business, yeah.
Oh my goodness,
Yeah.
I do not have a law degree, but I wish I did. No, I'm kidding, but I have to say though that it's in a few states they've made it a priority, but we have so many other things happening in the U.S. right now that, at least at the national level, there really is not much of a discussion going on. EPA's strategy came out in 2 years ago, full 2 years ago, and even though they are doing work, I know it's there, but you don't see flashy events and big speeches. It doesn't pop up, in anything that the president talks about. It comes up in fact sheets around, high-level visits. And new initiatives that are being launched between, the United States and countries around the world. For example, the US-EU is launching a transatlantic initiative for sustainable trade, and there is going to be a large circular economy component to that, which is good. But we're talking at sort of the mid-level manager level that pays attention to that. It's really not at the forefront of politics right now, which is it's unfortunate. We need to do that, but there's also so many other issues going on that I kind of can't blame them.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You mentioned EPR. Obviously there's a Canadian experience underway. Europe's been doing it for a number of years now. If it's not EPR, are there other good sort of policy solutions that you see out there that are worth considering? I know we've looked in the Great Lakes region. It's everything from doing nothing and very cheap landfilling, and everyone goes to landfill, to bottle bills, to states thinking about EPR. So if it's not EPR or a version of EPR, are there other sort of policy measures out there in the US that you see as a good practice that get you along that hierarchy of sustainable materials management from doing nothing to doing something?
Yeah, I mean, there can be policies that incentivize, recycling through, if it's tax incentives or other financial or pricing mechanisms that that create more of a level playing field for recycled, post-recycling materials to be on par with raw materials in terms of being integrated back into manufacturing. Do you tax the use of the raw material? Do you increase fees on landfilling? So there are, but one policy that's sort of been in place, but not permanently, it has to be renewed every several years, is 100% depreciation on equipment. And it applies to manufacturing across the board, but the recycling industry, which is sort of recognized, if not in law, but in practice, as a manufacturing industry. If you purchase a new piece of equipment, you can write that off from having to pay taxes, recognizing that the use of the equipment, which is important to the operations and keeping jobs in place and keeping the doors open, of course, gets wear and tear over time, and so there's that recognition on that in our tax code. So those are opportunities, and then also I want to sort of just reemphasize that circular economy is demand driven. If there are companies that are going to use the recycled materials after they've been processed, that will, and there's more uptake of that will spur more recycling, I assure you. And, we do see the brands making even more commitments towards, green supply chains, sustainability in their products. They want more material. And, sometimes we have to deal with current infrastructure, but there is innovation to make sure that more material flows through and gets to the manufacturers. And so those are ways that if you can incentivize the manufacturers to want to incorporate more, that would be helpful. Just to tie in really quickly on critical minerals and some of the things that Ramona and I have been talking about is, lithium-ion batteries is a great example where there's a lot of discussion about recycling of the batteries, which is really super important, but still trying to figure out who and how much recycled lithium is going to be incorporated back into use, whether it's into a battery or some other productive use. And that's, that's hard. So you can do a lot. And this is where up until recent new emphasis on the Circular Economy Action Plan in Europe, yes, there is recycling mandate. There is, a lot of collection and a lot of processing, but there isn't as much of the uptake of the material, and neither here either. But so we need to incentivize manufacturers to use that content more.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Ramona, do you want to jump in on that?
Yes, just a quick point. I mean, one of the strategies we employ is a bit of a sneaky one, a bit like vegetables in your kids' food, right? So there's so much attention on decarbonization that what we realized is you can't have a separate conversation about circularity. So the pre-competitive alliance called the First Movers Coalition is actually aggregating demand for hard to decarbonize but essential materials like concrete, steel, aluminum, jet fuel, et cetera. So what we've actually done is we're in active discussions to insert circularity into their procurement guidelines so that it becomes normal to see it there whenever people think about decarbonization. And I actually think that may be a strategy that many other people, so to Adina's point, I mean, I remember having a conversation with a minister, and she said, circularity is very important to us. I believe it's priority number 19 out of 26. And that was the moment at which I thought, okay, we really have to start thinking differently and stop being on this sort of glorious island of circularity discussing, and find ways to hijack, position, leverage, I'm sorry if these words are not kind of, rosy, but they're efficient, right? It's just about finding a way to make this part of something without anyone really noticing.
Yeah, that's helpful. Ilse, any thoughts?
I just wanted to highlight some of the work and lessons that we've been having from our side. Like, as I hear this conversation, I'm starting thinking that it's more and more relevant from our end and our work to find alignment between the countries, because right now it seems that it's in the three countries' agenda to advance circular economy, but still it seems that everyone's working in different timings. So that's something to keep in mind when we're working at a regional scale. For example, Mexico right now has a whole different agenda on renewable energy technologies than Canada and the United States. And also, just for you to know a bit of what's going on in Mexico right now, the government is just announced a national strategy on circular economy. But it somehow seems that everyone's in a different place. So aligning and just like, I'm still not sure how to get there, but it's something to keep in mind when we're working at this regional scale.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think that the sequencing and the syncing of this conversation is going to be extremely important. And maybe that's going to happen in an organized way from government to government conversations through CEC. To Adina's point, we have the auto sector, we have this history and this experience. Maybe it's going to self-align, self-form, I'm not sure. Maybe there's a hybrid in between where we really need to set up these forums where we have business and government and academia in North America at different scales, really trying to drive this conversation and it sounds like speed it up a bit and get to a place where there is that alignment, from a market standpoint, from a policy standpoint. So really, really important reflections. Do you see, this is a question for Adina and for Ramona as well, when you look at, at least in the US and Canada, a lot of talk around supply chain resiliency, a lot of talk around supply chain security. You're seeing sustainability creep into those discussions more and more and more. Carbon, materials. Do you see circular economy, supply chain resiliency or security maybe being the backdoor driver of a circular economy discussion as opposed to it, I think, being seen as, purely as an environmental driven kind of discussion? So is it creeping into other discussions like supply chain resiliency and security, and is that a different opportunity to really try and embed this in a much more economic trade way than just the environmental lens that some have been looking at it through?
Yeah, no, I think it's there, and it's definitely pressed by groups like ours, where we make sure that it's embedded in there. We organized an event back in December looking at whether or not we could create a fully integrated critical mineral supply chain just to the Western Hemisphere. If you look at current trade flows right now, you have mining in Canada, United States, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia. Well, less so Bolivia, I suppose, but and Brazil, and you have all this mining, you have a lot of consumption, demand drive, especially in North America, but there's a detour, for the minerals to be processed in Asia and then to come back for use. And so we wanted to see, could we eliminate that detour? And we made sure that circular economy was like a key component of the conversation among participants of like, how can we get there? And there's a definite consensus, like, yes, it needs to be a part of it, but which is that finally we're scaling lithium, circular economy. Aluminium is considered a critical mineral in both Canada and the United States. Copper is considered a critical mineral only in Canada. I'm not sure why not in the United States, but it should be. But those metals are also, pretty well situated in a fairly functioning circular economy. But there's a lot of other critical minerals that are not. And how do we spur research and development and market drive for that? Which includes also thinking about eco-design and creating that whole ecosystem. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't, I don't think it does. I know it does include a component where recycled metal, if that's incorporated into the automobile, as long as it was recycled within North America, then that can make that automobile also, or the incentives from that, are eligible. And I do think that will help spur some more, thinking and development, and creating the technology that's required and scaling that up. But it is still largely focused on battery components and the minerals that are in the batteries, and not necessarily, much more broadly. But hopefully it'll get there, because I think the attention is starting to grow.
Sure. Ramona?
I think there's 2 points I'd like to make. One is about a big existential risk. I'm sorry to bring another one in, but if you play this out, the Global South are currently using arguments that they cannot transition away from fossil fuel because there is an insufficiency of critical minerals and an insufficiency of money. See the empty loss and damage fund, for an example, if you need one. And I actually think that the more that this becomes a kind of national security issue, we do run the risk of cutting across a global justice issue and actually speeding up one energy transition while scuppering another. So just to kind of, we kind of have to do both and. We need to raise it up the agenda, but make sure it's not a purely defensive play. And then the second thing, I have been really surprised that I haven't heard anything about capital markets in this glorious market-driven continent that I'm sitting in. Because, European capital markets, we're all a bit weedy and so on. But here, the capital markets are really, really a force, and they can be a force for good. There was some research that was done by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that showed that companies that adopted circular strategies, particularly for resilient supply chains at scale, actually perform better. And if we could find some way to incentivize that in the borrowing rates, as interest rates go up, as money gets more expensive, anything that gives companies back a market-based, finance-based credit for doing more than, as the earlier speaker said, stopping at the red light, is actually a really important lever. And that doesn't involve politics, or hardly at all. And then finally, a piece on blended finance. Municipalities have always managed to raise money for projects. They lost most of it in the financial crash, but that doesn't mean they can't climb back and raise money again to do things like this. So the ability for them to get blended finance for creating positive health, environmental and other outcomes doesn't seem to have been anywhere near developed as much as it can. So something that I will do as soon as I have a minute and $1 to do it is really much more of a push with capital markets and banks to push some of these things along.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And on the capital markets side of things, I'm not sure what the situation in the U.S., but I certainly see the big banks in Canada very, very focused on climate change and carbon. That is sort of the issue that they have picked. You don't hear as much around circular economy and some of those other sustainability issues, even though I think they should. So.
Well, I think the risk is if it's only about carbon, then carbon sequestration will solve it all.
Yeah.
And we know it isn't. So again, that's why we need to sneak the vegetables into the pasta.
Yeah. Adina, in the United States, where are you seeing the capital markets align? Do you see it being much broader, or is it like Canada, where they seem to be really, really, really focused on climate change and carbon? Where do you see the capital markets in the U.S. when it comes to this?
I have to admit, I'm a close admirer or follower or knowledge expert on capital markets, but I think there's still a heavy emphasis on ESG issues, kind of writ large, and looking at opportunities for carbon cutting and greener industries and all of that. Politics notwithstanding, because politics still in our country thinking about The climate agenda is kind of hit or miss depending on who you talk to. I mean, there is a strong support and understanding of climate risks in both parties, but how to get there and how companies should be involved is still kind of a little bit hairy sometimes, I guess. But I think generally, at least in the banking sector, that they are still thinking about like, well, climate-related environmental disasters cost us a lot of money, so maybe we should be thinking about mitigation strategies for the future.
Yeah. No, that's fair. And I think it was 2 weeks ago where all states said that they're stop insuring housing insurance in California. So you can certainly understand the focus on climate change and carbon for sure. Listen, we've got they booked us to 4:30, which I think is a lot more time. We could almost have another panel discussion. So I want to give back some of your day, but I do want to end with 10 minutes or so with questions from the audience, because we've got a great panel of experts with different perspectives, global, US, North America. So why don't we get some questions from the audience, if there are any, and fire away. We've got one question over here. Even if you have some insights that you want to share from your perspective, I know there's brands in the room. There's policy folks. Feel free to share your insights in terms of how you're thinking about circular economy and scaling across borders as well. A question over here.
Yes, thanks for the information and the presentation. So I come from Manitoba, and as with most policy, will always be takers. Very rarely, like we're not big enough to participate in any real way on any of this. In absence of the minute and the dollar that you need to address the capital markets and availability for municipalities, which that minute and dollar have been decades in the coming, is there truly anything that these small municipalities, mid-sized cities can actually be doing that is just not a waste of time and money? Or do we just sit and wait? And I'm not being facetious at all. There are limited resources for a lot of this stuff, and because we are policy takers in all ways, some of the stuff that you guys are, I say you guys like the Toronto folks or the Vancouver folks, when you come to my province, you'd be like, oh my God, we did this 25 years ago. Yeah, but you also did it with twice the population, 3 times the density. So it's a legitimate question, because they need to know that what they're going to do is going to actually be effective. And if waiting is the right thing to do, I would love somebody with expertise in this area to chime in on that. Thank you.
No, it's a great question. I guess, my experience in the Great Lakes region, we've got 15,000, government entities, small, medium-sized cities, counties, right? There's capacity issues, there's access to finance issues. What you've just said is very, very real outside the big metros from Chicago and Toronto and what have you. So Adina, Ramona, Ilse, any thoughts on that question? Like, how do the smaller jurisdictions, medium-sized jurisdictions really think about this and position themselves, to respond to this?
I have a brief comment. So I've been asking myself the same question, and some people that I've been talking about have been asking me the same way, how like cities and local governments can really collaborate and be part of these regional change, right? So we need to create those channels, and when I get back to the CC, I'll start talking about it and trying to find ways to do that, because I don't know, and I think there should be the channels to have that interaction.
Yeah.
I'd say, there are a lot of small but mighty civic sort of natural communities, whether they're small cities or rural areas, whatever, that have done something quite interesting. And I'd point to, for example, Wales and Scotland being 2 of the first places to really set a very, very ambitious circular strategy. And these are places with plenty of rural areas, depopulation, relatively low skills base, relatively low investment base. But somehow the setting of the ambition starts to have an attractive quality. And I really think that I personally was involved in investing in and also setting up startups mainly for left behind parts of the world, where a lot of these common issues of low density, low tax base, all these issues compound. And one of the things that I've been pleased to observe is that whenever something is created with the needs of those specific communities in mind, it actually scales up quickly. And I was talking about the example of a company called Ride Tandem that was set up to solve the transport poverty issue in the north of England, a place that has long been neglected, overlooked, underinvested in, and eventually voted for Brexit as a result. So this is actually a ride sharing for low-wage workers, based on the insight that low-wage workers were spending a disproportionate amount of money getting to work because there was no bus infrastructure, or if there was, it was far too expensive, et cetera, et cetera. But for this issue in transport to solve, aggregating demand, creating an opportunity for the taxi firms, but also reducing the carbon of you effectively created a peri-public transport network. Reimagine what public transport looks like in a rural, low-density, poverty-stricken area. These kinds of business models applied to whatever social innovation you're trying to create, they're inherently circular, they're inherently efficient, and they tend to get great levels of uptake because, frankly, there aren't a lot of options otherwise. And they have and then there's great civic pride, So I think there's plenty of strategies. I would say absolutely don't wait. Think about what's most important and rally the citizenry and find allies to get something different done.
Are you seeing any good inventories, platforms globally where smaller, medium-sized cities can go and say, here's a great case study, or an inventory of lessons learned or experiences that they can look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think Adina, you've got a thought. Please
go ahead, Adina, if you want.
I was going to say, and again, I don't know if these if or how these organizations work in Canada, but just from the U.S. experience, we have several organizations where the smaller municipalities and cities have a voice, and whether it's through the governors or the lieutenant governors associations, there's a council,
conference of mayors,
there's the mayors, there's the counties, there's an association of counties that I've interacted with. I just can't think of the name at the moment, but there's a whole bunch of these groups, and the National Council for State Legislators. There's all kinds of different ways that I've had a chance to interact. Sitting from Washington D.C. and hearing their experiences directly.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So maybe FCM. I know in Ontario it's probably AMO. If those discussions aren't happening, maybe that's a topic of discussion for FCM. But just back to you, Ramona, are there any global inventories that you're aware of that you can go and grab, a case study here, a case study there?
I honestly think this is a personal opinion only, but the resources required to maintain libraries of case studies versus the level of marketing you need to make people know they're there. And plus the fact is whenever anyone sees a case study, they say, well, my situation is different. So I think the best way of actioning things is really to find allies. And I'll take away an action to see if there's anyone in our community who might also be able to help. So
super helpful. Question here, and then sorry, I didn't see your. Were you first, and then back there, and then up here. Okay.
Oh. Hi, Carolina Seward from Environment Canada. I just wanted to unpack a little bit more the sneaking vegetables into the climate perspective. I kind of wonder whether climate is the only impact we should be focusing on with respect to the circular economy. I know it's what's politically driving a lot of change right now, but we know biodiversity is coming up. And we know there's all these other sort of outcomes that we might be able to achieve with circularity, even in advance of seeing the emissions reductions, because we don't quite know how to measure the emissions impacts of circularity. They feel more diffuse when there's scope 3 and along supply chains, et cetera. So there's sort of like short-term versus long-term impact. And I'm just wondering, how to more holistically measure the impact of circularity how to pitch that.
Sure. So remember I said at the beginning, all these ideas are about people, climate, and nature. So this is in no way trying to dumb down circularity. However, it is about trying to leverage and jump on the bandwagon of carbon which everyone is working on, and where if you just get people thinking about circularity and carbon, or the link between circular economy and net zero, it just helps put it on the agenda in a way. Otherwise people's brains explode. When people start saying, okay, God, now I have to think about carbon and climate and health benefits and gender equity and biodiversity and nature, you know what? I just can't, right? So don't take this to mean in any way, and I'm really glad you asked the question, that this is a suggestion to dumb down the agenda. It's quite the opposite. It's to enrich it, but subtly. It's to make it a more rounded discussion using the vector that is there, in the majority of discussions. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, that was a hesitant yes.
Oh, sorry, there was a measurement question as well. Let me just address that. So what we're also trying to do is go to the standard setters who are mainly working on carbon. And again, like net zero, like First Movers Coalition or Greenhouse Gas Protocol, try and have conversations with them to say, look, there will never be one easy measure for circularity, one ring to rule them all. I mean, it was something that all of our stakeholders wanted. Just come up with a way of measuring it that everybody can use. It's impossible. But what you can do is you can start to try and round out and also explore where the tensions might be between a simple carbon measurement and a more rounded thing, and start to introduce considerations that are context specific, that are equity or nature related. Because I think actually a lot of that is very place-based. I don't think you can have a conversation about measurement that is independent of a community or a location, because the issues are going to be quite different. So again, it's not about dumbing it down, it's about making sure it shows up in the standard setters' agendas, because they do have a lot of power. I hope that helped a bit more.
Yeah, it is a really good question, because I do feel sometimes that it's starting to collapse under its own weight, right? Because it's carbon, it's circular economy, it's water, it's biodiversity, and it's becoming big. And then when you look at, well, how does that connect, and how do you measure, and all of this other stuff, and it's like now you're in quicksand, and it's like, how do you even start by starting when you're adding in all these different layers and complexities to it, and unpacking that and just trying to get yourself on a path, right? Adina, I don't know if you have any thoughts. I don't know if you heard that question around circularity, carbon measurement. Yeah.
I rely on Ramona's expertise to answer questions like that.
Yeah. We have a question up here.
So if you look at, Adina was saying she's working with 51 different states, and we were in a previous workshop earlier about battery storage and EV battery chains, and the question came up is, how do you government-proof the policies? Because you have maybe governments that change every 4 years with different ideas and different policies. How do you government-proof this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I certainly, from my perspective in the Great Lakes region, creating the forums and the collaborations with business and government and others outside there, so there are stronger external forces where people can see that this is important. We have to start. We have to put in frameworks. We have to keep it going. So it's not just driven necessarily by at least the mayors or the state assemblies. Like, it has to be some kind of external movement outside of government. And have a lot more voices around the table. So it's not just environment, but it's business and others. That's been certainly my thought. But Adina, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, by the way, because I grapple with that every day. But I think, what the government is doing is they're setting up the foundational infrastructure, or lack of a better word, or maybe that's what it is physically, to make that become a market economy into it of itself. And if it becomes, where you have that market drive, you have the businesses that can supply into it, the materials are high quality, and people are making money, of course, it will thrive on its own. Just as a great example, a little bit in parallel, I mean, the recycling of metal has been happening for generations. But World War II, especially in the United States, where the government was, saying, give us your scrap. We'll take everything and anything that you have made of metal. We need it. Put it into the war machine. We need to make airplanes and all that stuff. And, unbeknownst to everybody, you created its own sort of functioning industry of, people collecting scrap metal, realizing it has value, getting it to the collection centers, the collection processes it, gets it to the manufacturer, makes a product, and then that product is decommissioned, and the metal goes back into the same system, and that's your circle. And so what the government is trying to do is create that impetus to create that circle and to give it to the foundations so that it can function on its own, irrespective of government policy.
Yeah, really good point. Ilse, Ramona, any thoughts on how do we future-proof some of these discussions and debates? Feel free to pass.
Yeah, I pass for this.
You heard me say the word Slovenia earlier. And have a look at the climate case study on how Slovenia, a new country of 2 million people, took their entire circular economy strategy out of government and put it in effect in a long-term governance trust, so no one could mess with it. It proved to be quite a prescient move.
Can you explain just a little bit what's a long-term governance trust? It's the first I've heard of that.
It's effectively where you agree to take something out of the political system because it's of too great an importance to be left to short-term cycles. I mean, there are things like there are also, I mean, the UK government gave interest rate control to the Bank of England, you know, to grant independence. There are examples of this. You know, governance methods that remove something out of so data trusts are another example. There's plenty of these governance models knocking around. You know, I just mentioned the one that I know for circularity, but you can borrow ideas from elsewhere.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. Any other questions, thoughts? Over here and then over here.
This is a question for CCES. You mentioned that one of your projects, you're working with all 3 countries in North America and, you know, potentially having a pilot project in waste management. And as a waste nerd, I'm very, very curious to know how and what that's going to look like in terms of, you know, for example, even in Ontario, our municipalities are snowflakes, right? You know, we have different legislations. I can't imagine leading a project that, again, crosses 3 countries in waste management specifically and with different languages and policies. So maybe go in depth a little bit more about that and how you want that to look, or how the project looks actually.
Yeah, sure. Just to clarify, that project is actually led by one of my colleagues. She's unfortunately sick, so she's not here, but I can speak to what I know about it. So it's quite an interesting project. As I said, we have 3 waste streams that we're focusing on, and depending on the interest of the country, we're focusing a bit more on a specific waste stream. Canada and the US are more interested in plastics, and Mexico is more interested in carton and paper. And well, the pilots will really vary and will depend on the results of these milestones projects. But what we usually do when we do pilot projects at this scale is that we choose a city or a specific city where we're gonna work, usually 1 per country, and that's how we run our pilots. Because it's hard to really do something at that scale, and based on the results that we get in that specific site, then we build recommendations to try to scale whatever results we get from those pilots. So that's usually how that works.
Yeah.
I might on this actually suggest having a look at the Nordic Circular Hotspot, because they've managed to create a cross-country alliance. I mean, their languages are maybe a tiny bit more similar, but apparently not very. I can't really judge. You know, the similarities between Icelandic and Norwegian, but they have set up a structure that kind of looks at how to do this across different environments.
Yeah, and we're certainly, you know, trying to do that, at least in the Canada-U.S. Great Lakes perspective. It's still early days, but, you know, very similar, trying to build off of the European models of cross-country collaboration. Question over here.
Yes, I wanted to dwell on the politics of circularity for a little bit. For context, I am Chinese. I've lived here in Canada. I've worked in the UK and EU. And increasingly, I'm seeing, you know, back to Ramona, you mentioned not to get defensive and sort of as we come to the issue of just transition. And there seems to be a tension between circularity as an instrument to material and energy security, coming against sort of the 90s movement of globalization and free trade. And how do you envision the future? Like, what is the future that we're heading to in that dynamic? Because when I look at, for example, the Chinese literature on circular economy and their circular economy strategy, they're talking about an inner and outer loop, and they still very much want to be in that global system. But I can see, for example, recently in the States and the European Union, as they, for example, have this negotiation around low carbon steel and aluminium, you start to see some players being locked out under that facade of low carbon transition. So I know it's an intractable problem, but I would love to get your opinion on that.
Oh, it's such a good question. I mean, that's partly why we keep it on the agenda, because we are completely neutral, and also WRI has very significant operations in India, in China, in the global south more broadly. I think it's a reaction. I mean, I think the challenge is when you're faced with something that is a threat, you react with the toolkit you have. And my ambition personally would be, that I hope many of you share, would be that that toolkit contains circular economy to an equal level as the toolkit that says national security and kind of protectionism. But we are in a very tumultuous period with kind of all sorts of roiling, geopolitical tensions, backlash from globalization, domestic issues. So I don't think it is easy to make an equivalent case for that, but we must keep trying. And I'd personally like to see this more present in the climate negotiations. I was very disappointed by last year's COP, where if circular economy was mentioned once or twice, it was entirely to do with battery recycling or plastic recycling. It was not actually to do with equity. And so building the link between just transition and circular economy, I think, is something we all owe it to the field to try and do. It's not a perfect answer. It is an intractable problem, but that's a route through, I think. And the more progressive policymakers know. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you were done.
Yeah, go ahead, Adina.
I was.
Yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree with Ramona. The only thing I want to add to it, because I'm in an organization that doesn't have operations anywhere, so talk a little bit more freely. I mean, I think it also depends on how governments are thinking about what circular economy should mean to them, and whether or not that means that it's a internal economy. And I think that's what's happening. That is definitely what's happening in China. It's happening a little bit in Europe as well, where there's an idea of being self-sufficient, that products that are consumed within the country and come to the end of their life should be processed within the country and then reintegrated within the country. And, that sort of, dismisses the fact that trade has linked a global circular economy for decades and decades, especially in the metal space, because even though the US actually could be considered completely self-sufficient in scrap metal, you still have imports and exports because metals are different with the different alloys. There's different smelters all over the world that take different types of metals. And so that you see the purchasing, the buying and selling of metal across borders, including still in some ways between China and the rest of the world. So I think I think your question is correct. It's hard to kind of crosswise that with, general climate initiatives and priorities, just as Ramona said, and how do we make sure that circular economy is the top 3, not the top 26, topic in decarbonization and climate, discussions and all that. But I think it's and I think it is that climate space where governments can continue to come to consensus, irrespective of the fact that different governments are approaching it in different ways.
Yep.
Yeah.
If I can add one sentence, I think a lot of the trick to this lies in equating supply and demand. I mean, I come from the energy sector, and it was always amazing to me how people would rush toward the new energy supply source and do almost nothing on energy demand. And when you think about the innovations, the capacity, how rich we already are in much of the global north in resources, we could afford to invest a lot more in demand management, which is frankly so boring that no politician gets excited about it, but is really an important lever in on all of this leveling up in the world.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? I feel people sloping into their chairs, maybe getting tired near the end of the day. So no other questions? Any insights that folks want to share from your vantage point in terms of how you're thinking about circularity and scaling across borders? Right here?
Yeah, because it's always about sufficient source of supply, but we know that so much production is wildly inefficient. I mean, energy production, up to 40% of energy is wasted. You know, water, quite a lot of it is wasted. There's still so much to be done on the management side that would then, of course, concurrently reduce your needs and then allow other people to have them. It's really dead simple to say.
Well, we got one more question here. Yeah. Follow up, maybe.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to the demand side and tie it into the behavioral change as well. Again, just speaking from my personal experience, when I was growing up in China, my family is very frugal, even though we are sort of middle class. You know, you get scolded if you leave the tap running or you brush your teeth or sort of let it run while the water heats. Always close your light when you leave your room, right? And then when I moved here, I was astonished to see that street lights are on at night when all the shops are closed. And it was mind-boggling. And I have to admit that having lived here for over a decade, my own behavior is becoming a little bit wasteful. You know, I don't think twice before I sort of leave the light on when I'm out of the apartment, and you know, when I come back, and of course it's kind of like, why did I do that? So in terms of, you know, are there movements or are there sort of initiatives, things that we can do at personal but also sort of organizational level that we can do to counter that kind of gradual shift towards a kind of a wasteful, inefficient behavior, whether it's in households or in businesses?
Yeah.
You know, I have a 16-year-old daughter who wants to be a marine biologist. She's still got a couple more years of high school before she goes to university. And she's driving behavioral changes in our home. And this is a major trend that is constantly written up in newspapers in the United States in particular, where you have the younger generations that are thinking more about that, thinking of their own consumption behavior, and you know, giving their parents like us a hard time for some of our old wasteful practices. And I think that's going to be a major driver of change, is as the younger generations start to get older and they become entrepreneurs and they innovators and just thought leaders on this subject. I think that's really going to accelerate change in particular.
Mm-hmm. Let me give one hopeful example. The UK used to have an absolutely horrific rate of post-consumer food waste loss. And there was an organization called WRAP that exists to this day. It has hundreds of people working in food loss and waste around the world. They managed to actually narrow the gap by something like 10 percentage points over a decade, which is phenomenal, particularly when you have to actually influence consumers. They did all kinds of stuff. They engaged brands like Lurpak, the butter brand, that did a big poster campaign called Love Your Leftovers. I mean, basically any leftovers better fried in butter. We all know this. But then the other thing I would point out is on the institutional side, I actually think a lot of this change can and needs to happen through institutions in ways that individuals don't even notice. So my husband actually worked for many years for someone called the Carbon Trust. They did a ton of stuff on built environment and put in sensors and various other things to automatically switch lights off. I mean, you can't just wait for an energy crisis and the bills to quadruple before people are conscious. But then the other thing is a WRI initiative called Cool Food, which is actually around shifting plant-based diets through institutional catering, which I think is an exceptionally clever way of the kind of systems acupuncture approach. You know, a third of meals are served in institutions. Therefore, if you want to shift diets, you just need to provide delicious recipes and better procurement for institutions. They save money, people get healthier, you lower the planetary balance, and then you include innovations like Winnow, which measures food waste and gets better and better at estimating demand. So this whole basket of things works together, and I think it is personally better wholesale to consumer, because consumer shaming never really got us anywhere.
Yeah. The only one point that I would add from a business standpoint is having more corporations and corporate leaders really leading into the conversation around what profit and purpose looks like. We heard that phrase this morning, and what sustainability looks like. There was one breakout that I participated in this morning, and it sounded like the issue is all about managing an issue, an irritant. It's a constant negotiation when we think about carbon or circularity or water or this. I didn't know doing the right thing and sustainability needed to be a constant negotiation and irritant. So I think companies, particularly driven by ESG and CSR and that history, there are companies that I think are really trying to transform the way that they do business and around that purpose and that profit lens. And I think the more that businesses alongside government and others can get out there and really show the way, I think it does start to change the conversation. And obviously consumers themselves are starting to change that conversation, and driven by our 16-year-old kids, right? So, but I do think corporations can lean much more forward on this and show the way, and not always, come at it like, oh, this is just another regulation we're going to fight, or it's damn the torpedoes on this, or because sometimes that's the way that people see it through, and I don't think it's fair, and I think there is a big role that businesses can play in this conversation around what does sustainability look like, what does a purpose-driven profit look like.
And sorry, if I can add one sentence, I can't help myself. So one of the reasons we do fewer public events and more closed round events is that the dialogue is much more constructive in a room under Chatham House than it is out in public, because businesses will often say to you, listen, all we want is, to Adina's earlier points, a level playing field and some clarity and consistency. Please don't keep changing the prices of the regulations, it's driving us crazy. But they will only have that discussion in confidence. And I think more and more of those thoughtful, productive partnership discussions are really what's going to get us there.
Yeah.
And we need to keep them honest, because making commitments is different from seeing them in action.
100%.
Indeed.
Yeah. But I would also say, and I saw this in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, where, and Adina, maybe you can speak to this, is this retreat from corporate America around ESG, because there is a backlash around ESG, woke, this, that, and the other. Like, if there's any time where I think businesses and business leaders need to be stepping in around, profit and purpose and sustainability, now is the time for them to really be out there to say that, it's good for the world, it's good for our business, and not retreating when there's pushback politically, through that ESG lens.
It's a really tough environment. I will say that I don't think that they're necessarily retreating from the commitment. I think they're retreating from how they publicize that.
Yeah.
Just to kind of be careful, but I think a lot of the companies still are going to meet or try to endeavor to meet their commitments. I would also say that if there is any backtracking, it's actually because of the marketplace. So for example, a lot of the beverage makers really, really do want to supply beverages in plastic bottles made from recycled plastic, but the problem is they can't get enough of it.
Yeah.
There's some regulatory infrastructure issues. For example, it must be FDA approved. The recycler has to be FDA approved to be able to handle food grade, plastics and all that stuff. So that limits, the amount of supply. But other than that, I actually think they're just stepping back from publicizing it so that they don't have, public backlash.
Yeah. I guess my only point is that, if the public sees them backtracking, right, because the political discussion is hot, then I think that does reframe the conversation a bit about how consumers and perhaps others, might think of it in a broader sense. Like, I think they need to be in that discussion and in that debate. Yeah.
I agree, but I think what Ramona was just saying earlier about just sort of slipping it in, under the rug.
The vegetables,
and
slipping in the vegetables, yeah.
Yeah,
all right.
Exactly. I think there's a lot of that that people don't really realize, and so at least that's happening.
Depends
still.
On the vegetables in my household.
Maybe.
But well, listen. Let's thank a terrific panel, a terrific discussion to close out today. Really appreciate it. We're giving back almost 15 minutes of your time. So enjoy the fresh air out there. And thank you again for a great discussion and a great panel. Okay, round of applause.